So I briefly showed you the competitive labor market equilibrium at the end of last chapter. Now we're going to dig into it more. So first, a competitive labor market has many buyers and sellers. There are enough firms that they are not able to effectively set the price. If a firm tries to offer too low of a wage, workers will choose to go elsewhere. Likewise, workers do not have the kind of market power where they can command their own salaries. We can obviously think of some cases where this happens. So things like CEOs or pro athletes, where they are so talented, there's so few people out there that can do what they do that they can command their own wages. But in general, workers have to take what's offered to them. In a competitive labor market, equilibrium occurs when the number of workers willing to work at a certain wage equals the number of jobs employers are offering at that wage. This balance sets the wage level and the total number of jobs. At this point, there's no shortages and no surpluses in the labor market. So you don't have workers that want to work that are sitting out of a job at that wage. And you don't have a bunch of firms that want to hire people, all these open positions that they can't find workers for at that wage. However, it's important to remember, like we talked about in chapter 1, that labor markets are constantly changing. New jobs open up, workers gain new skills, some retire, some switch industries entirely. So while equilibrium gives us a sense of balance, in reality, the labor market is always moving towards that balance, but rarely stays there. While it may not exactly be in equilibrium or be there very long, the market is always moving towards equilibrium. So this is an incredibly valuable model. And one of the reasons I try to highlight that we're constantly being knocked out of equilibrium or moving towards equilibrium is because I don't want you to look at the labor force or from hiring within your own company and to think, wow, this really does not match what I see. This model doesn't encapsulate the real world very well. So I want to highlight that this is not the state that we're constantly in, but it's what we're moving towards. Now, my wife likes Hallmark movies, so I've been watching a bunch of them lately. So let's think of a small town with a cute bakery run by the protagonists of one of these movies. Let's say they need 10 workers and they're willing to pay $15 an hour as their wage. If there are exactly 10 people who want to work for that $15, the market is in equilibrium. There are as many workers willing to work at that wage as there are job openings that the firm is willing to pay or hire the workers and pay them that wage. But let's suppose suddenly 5 more people want jobs. Well, now the bakery might lower wages since more workers are available to work those jobs. And because there are more people, trying to find those jobs, trying to find a job, they'll be willing to take lower wages in order to get one. On the other hand, let's say 2 workers get married and they leave town. Now there's only 8 people there who want to work. The firm may need to increase the wage to attract more employees if they still want to hire 10 employees. So this figure here illustrates the labor market equilibrium. An equilibrium wage in employment is determined by the intersection of the supply and demand curves. So this point right here. In this case, the equilibrium wage is at this point here, W star, and the level of employment here is at E star. The S curve sloping upwards is the supply curve. This can represent the total number of people working, the total number of hours worked, or the total employee hours in the economy, depending on what we're trying to use the model for. I will typically simply call it the number of employees, again, to keep things simple and straightforward, unless the example specifically calls for something else. The D curve here is the demand curve. Remember, it's downward sloping, and it represents the total number of either people working, number of hours worked, or the total employee hours in the economy that firms are willing to hire. Again, it'll always be the exact same one as the supply curve. Again, in this case, I'll be working with employment or number of employees as much as possible because that's the simplest thing to conceptualize for our examples. When the labor market is in equilibrium, the unemployment rate is 0. This is just basically a definition because in this case, everyone who is willing to work has a job. Everyone who is out of work in this case is choosing not to work. They're leaving labor force. Remember, unemployment rate does not count people who leave the labor force, even though they still exist in the real world. Once the equilibrium wage is established, each firm will hire workers until their wage equals the value of the marginal product of labor. When we add up all the firms together, the employment level is going to equal this E star right here. Now, what happens if the wage of firms are offering is above the equilibrium wage? Say in this case, up here at W prime. Well, at this point, there will be a surplus of workers willing to work at this wage. Looking at where the labor demand curve crosses this wage, firms will want to hire EL workers. So at the demand curve here, at that wage, trace that straight down to EL. But that's, if you should notice, less than the equilibrium wage, or equal number of workers, excuse me. But at this higher wage, more workers are going to be willing to work. If we trace this out to the supply curve, we hit the supply curve here, go all the way down to EH. So that's how many are willing to work at this higher wage. Once this happens, once firms see that there are a lot more people willing to take these jobs and there are job openings, they can start offering lower wages than this W prime. So start moving down here towards the equilibrium wage. Some workers will begin to accept those offers, while others will leave the labor market entirely because the wages aren't high enough. Over time, more workers will leave and more firms will be willing to hire as wages fall, moving us along the supply and demand curves down to E. So as we drop down from W prime down to W star, as the wage moves down, we'll cross the demand curve lower. So firms will be willing to hire more workers, and we'll move down the supply curve because more workers are now leaving the labor force. Fewer want to work at that wage. Eventually, we'll go down and we'll reach the equilibrium wage and equilibrium, level of employment. At that point, there's no more incentive for firms to reduce wages. If they reduce wages, they'll be willing to hire more workers, but even fewer workers will be able to work, and they'll have all these job openings that they won't be able to fill. The best way to fill those job openings is start offering more money, and that'll bring them right back up to equilibrium if they decided to go too far. Now, this gray shaded area P right here represents the producer surplus when the market is in equilibrium. Going along the demand curve at the highest points, we can see this is the firm willing to hire a worker at this wage. It is high, so they won't hire many, but they'll be willing to pay for that first worker. For that first worker, they'll be willing to pay quite a bit way up here. But as they hire more and more, they'll be willing to pay less and less per worker. Eventually, we'll go down, we'll reach equilibrium here, where the firm is willing to pay the exact wage rate that that worker is receiving. Now, the difference between the wage rate that firms are willing to pay and the wage rate actually paid is called the producer surplus. So this whole area here between the demand curve, what they're willing to pay, and the wage that they're actually paying here is a producer surplus. This can be thought of as the surplus value that firms get from hiring workers at the equilibrium wage. Likewise, this kind of purplish gray area here, Q, below the wage rate and above the supply curve, represents the consumer surplus of the labor market when it's in equilibrium. To understand this, we start by looking at the supply curve. At the highest points along the supply curve, the workers would only be willing to work for a higher wage, so way up here. However, as we move down the supply curve, more workers are willing to accept a lower wage until we reach here, the equilibrium wage. At that point, workers are paid exactly what they're willing to work for. The consumer surplus is the difference between what workers are willing to accept and what they actually receive. So for instance, some workers might have been willing to work for a lower wage, so somewhere down here, but they're being paid the prevailing market wage or the equilibrium wage. So the sum of the area between what they're willing to work for and what they're actually being paid represents the surplus. And the values that workers get from receiving more than the minimum that they would accept to work. So imagine a retail store that hires seasonal workers for the holiday season. The retail store needs extra staff for the busy holiday season. So to fill the first position, they're willing to pay, let's say, up to $20 an hour. So this worker is critical. They really need to get that body in the door. However, as they hire more workers, each additional worker is slightly less crucial than the previous one. So let's say the second one, the store is only willing to pay $18 an hour for, all the way down until they reach $15 an hour, which is what they pay all the workers. So the surplus for the firm is the difference between what they would have been willing to pay. So $20 for the first worker, $18 for the second, so on and so forth, and the $15 that they actually pay. Now the store is saving some money because it's paying some workers less than they would have been willing to pay for their contribution to the business. Now let's look at the other side, on the worker side. Let's say the first worker was only willing to work if they could earn $10 per hour. Second would have been willing to work for $12 an hour and so on, up to the equilibrium wage that they're being paid at $15 an hour. For the workers, the difference between what they would have accepted, so the $10 to $12 an hour, and what they're actually being paid is their consumer surplus. This is the extra income above the minimum accepted wage. We call this their surplus, or the gain from working at the equilibrium wage. Now, if either the supply or demand curve for labor changes, this is going to shift the curves and cause the equilibrium wage and employment levels to change. For example, if a new company opens in town and needs more workers, the demand curve shifts to the right. So take this demand curve, and it'll move out to the right and be somewhere over here, crossing the supply curve at a higher point. So although this graph shows a snapshot at equilibrium, like we just took a quick picture, in reality, the labor market is constantly changing and moving as wages and job availability fluctuate. The supply and demand curves shift in response to real-world changes like technological advancement, shifts in consumer demand, and government policies, plenty of other things.